Well,
Great. So I'm
if the
just going to give
recording is
everyone
in
a minute to
progress,
take their seats.
I think we should be in progress. So, Osman?
Oh, yes. I think all the microphones are on. So I'm just going to begin. Hello and welcome to this Lee Center event covering the Kremlin from Dusko Doder to the present. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm a professor here at Columbia Journalism School and also the director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism, also here at the school. It's an honor to be here tonight with so many acclaimed correspondents who've covered Russia and made essential contributions to our understanding of the world. Though we've seen a wave of recent attention amidst Russia's war in Ukraine, the question of how to cover Russia in the face of media repression has vexed journalists for decades. I'm so pleased that we're joined tonight by acclaimed Moscow correspondents of the past and present to discuss the challenges of covering Russia and the lasting consequences of media repression. I'm especially pleased that this event sheds light on the work of a reporter, Dusko Doder, who made essential contributions. I'm going to hand over the podium now to someone most of you in this room know, and also who knows Doder as well, Peter Osnos, a former Moscow correspondent with the Post, a foreign editor, and the publisher of Doder's book, Shadows and Whispers, who will begin with some brief remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Azmat. And I should tell you that, can you hear me? How's the acoustics? Good. Azmat had no reason to do this, other than the fact that we asked her. And we asked her because we all sort of felt that we wanted to do something on behalf of Dusko and Louise. Didn't know quite what. Sandra Stiller, who's here somewhere, and another professor, introduced me to Azmat. Her work is remarkable. If you haven't followed it, her work for the Times, her work generally is remarkable on all kinds of things. And she really is the generation after ours. Or two. We all know, or three in some cases. We all know why we're here, and that is to recognize the work of Dusko. I mean, there's no surprise about that. It's he's a colleague, was a colleague, good friend to many of us. Called me Nachalnik, the only person who ever did that. It's boss in Russian. Dusko's gravely ill, but the indomitable Louise is here from Thailand. Says she's not jet lagged. When she gets home, I'm sure she'll tell Dusko all about this. And I don't know how much she'll absorb, but one way or another, you will tell him that this is about him and recognizing what he has done and what he represented and the whole tradition of Moscow journalism, Moscow correspondence. Dusko and Louise have written An Inconvenient Journalist, which is a terrifically, it's gripping, in some ways it's terrifying book. I have arranged with Bradley Graham and Lissa Muscatine. Bradley is another one of the old Post foreign correspondents who now owns a bookstore, Politics and Prose. So if you haven't read the book and want to, Brad's all set to sell it to you. All you have to do is go online and order it, and it'll be sent to you. One of the good things about bookstores these days is they've learned how to fulfill people's orders online. And Brad was really very much aware of this, and he too was an Eastern European correspondent for the Post. The program's going to start with remarks from John Randall. The only description of John Randall that applies, as far as I'm concerned, is legendary. The legendary John Randall. He pulled off one of the greatest tricks in the history of journalism. He persuaded the Post to let him do whatever he wanted for 6 months if he did whatever they wanted for 6 months. It was a unique achievement. It never happened today. Then he's going to introduce Louise, and Louise, as you all know, is Dusko's wife. She will talk about Dusko and their relationship. Then Kaiser over here, Bob, who among us was, I think, the most fully engaged in Dusko's work in Moscow because he was an editor in Washington. And in the aftermath, which again is the story that changed Dusko's life. My guess is he will remind us vividly of what happened. Then we'll turn to the panel. And I got a wonderful contribution today from Celestine Boland, who lives in Paris and was actually Dusko's sort of second, was that what she was when we actually had two people in Moscow? Then she later was there for twice. So Celestine has a very long and distinguished, in her own way, history. Her father was once the ambassador in Russia, Chip Boland. Anyway, she's written something lovely, and I'll read that. Then we'll have the panel with Serge, Pulitzer Prize winning Moscow correspondent, writing for the editorial page of the New York Times. And Cooper was in Moscow during the Perestroika era. Was the NPR when NPR had its first bureau in Moscow? Bureau, that's the exaggeration. It had somebody with a telephone.
The spare bedroom.
And later was the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. On the Zoom, hopefully.
Yes.
On the Zoom, by the way, the Zoom, we sent out a Zoom invitation, and there are people who wanted to be here who can't be here, and there are so maybe 20 people or so on Zoom. Or 2,000? I don't know that it's 2,000 because I was told not to share it too widely. But anyway, the Zoom is Joshua Yaffa. Joshua is the writer for New Yorker, a weekly magazine, based in Moscow. But he and his wife are now in Berlin. And it's be interesting to, in a sense, revealing to find out why they all had to leave. You know, even in the worst of the Cold War, there were correspondents in Moscow. They are not there now. The New York Times has one correspondent now in Moscow, Valerie Hopkins, who's not American, who's British or something. And she's been told specifically, don't write about the war. The Times is very, very sort of estimable. Russian staff is being paid and told not to work. So you have a unique situation where Russia at this moment is essentially being covered by text and phone, video. So Joshua's going to join us. We're going to let Joshua go as soon as we finish the panel before we go to questions, because he told me unequivocally he has to get up at the crack of dawn on a trip. And I said, I'm so sorry for you, Joshua. That's what you do for a living. So that's the plan. And let's start now with John, who promises to speak about Louise. And keep it, you know, we're going to move right along.
Thank you, Peter. We who spend our professional lives delving into muck of all kinds chickened out when it came to defending the honor of Dusko Doder, one of our own. His only failing was consistently scooping his colleagues when he was the Washington Post's Moscow correspondent in the early 1980s. Being ahead of the curve sometimes visits a terrible and long-lasting vengeance on its practitioners. So it was for Dusko, his wife Louise, and their two children. Years after his Moscow tour, motivated by jealousy and resentment, Time magazine ran a 2-page spread 30 years ago this month, suggesting Dusko sold out to the KGB and for a measly $1,000 at that. Last-minute efforts at a Washington dinner party by Kay Graham and Ben Bradley failed to move Shrove Talbot. He was too busy checking out as Times Washington bureau chief to move, and he was too busy checking in as to a key State Department job arranged by his fellow Yale Law School buddy, the recently elected President Bill Clinton. He couldn't be bothered with what then passed as for ethics. Such high-level support from his former employers especially notable since Dusko had left the paper to work in China for US News and World Report, reflected professional esteem he still enjoyed with the paper. Times article caught Dusko and his family at their most vulnerable, an alleged KGB agent seeking freelance work, since by then he had left US News after his China stint. He and Louise, a former Sunday Times of London foreign correspondent, had moved to Belgrade because it was a base to cover the emerging democracies of post-Soviet Eastern Europe. I then episodically was covering the Bosnian War and always made a point of visiting Dusko and the family whenever I was in Belgrade. I saw firsthand the steadily encroaching paralysis that came over him as a result of Time's hatchet job. He was incapable then of writing the obviously timely book about Milosevic, the Serbian dictator who had provoked the conflict. Throughout, Louise somehow kept the family together. We should all have wives like Louise, who gives it new meaning to stand by your man. She never gave up, even when the odds got longer over each of the passing 3 decades. I consider this evening miraculous. It goes a very long way to restoring Dusko's reputation. That this event is taking place tonight is in very large part due to my one-time foreign editor, Peter Osnos, and his magical connections. He specifically ordered me not to mention his name. Not for the first time have I disobeyed him. Hold on.
The things Randall said to me when I was foreign editor cannot be quoted in polite company. But you know, time heals.
It must be said in those days, such exchanges were considered to be part of the job. It was before political correctness.
It's a good thing. My wife wasn't on the phone when you talked to me. So, Louise, you in a sense are the most important person here. You can tell us what it's like now and tell us what it's been like. And needless to say, we're awfully glad you're here. And what you've done for Dusko under these extraordinary circumstances is really quite remarkable.
Well, thank you.
Louise.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to John and to Peter Osnos and Bob Kaiser. And Dusko is a proud Columbia J School graduate. I just wish he could be here, but he is seriously ill at our home in Thailand, and I'm here in his place. I was a journalist in Moscow when we met. We married a few years later. I saw close up how and why he reported so differently from the rest of us. His memoir, The Inconvenient Journalist, details all this, and it tells how he got his biggest scoops. I wrote the book with Dusko after he became ill with Lewy body dementia 6 years ago. As most of you know, Dusko became Washington Post Moscow bureau chief in 1981, and he set out to do something different. He wanted to focus almost exclusively on Kremlin power politics, on decisions being made within the secretive leadership of America's Cold War enemy, all important decisions to US national security. But he knew he had to be creative and audacious if he was going to evade the obstacles the KGB threw in our paths, the bugging us, following us, harassing our Soviet contacts, and so on. He had experienced all that working for 2 years at UPI's Moscow bureau more than a decade earlier. Anyone who knew Dusko in Moscow can conjure him up. Gruff, cigar smoking, hard drinking, rumpled. He spoke and often swore in fluent Russian. He nurtured and even exaggerated this persona on purpose. It was part of his plan to disarm and connect with Soviet officials on a human level. Growing up in communist Yugoslavia, then escaping to America as a young man, he understood in ways none of us could that communist officials were human beings and that their humanity was the key to drawing aside the veil of Kremlin secrecy. I frequently got to see him in action, and I'll tell just one story so that you'll understand how he operated. He was interviewing Pyotr Alexeyev, the editor of the newspaper Izvestia. They began with the usual formalities. Dusko did not need a translator. Alexeyev made a remark, and Dusko responded with a crude expletive. It is not one I can repeat here, but it involves doing unspeakable things to the other person's mother. And I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. Alexeyev and his two aides exchanged astonished glances and smirks. As the interview progressed, Dusko and Alexeyev became like two old drinking buddies, sharing stories. At one point, Alexeyev told Dusko the occupation of Afghanistan was going terribly. State media were reporting exactly the opposite. My God, Alexeyev said, crazy Muslim women even attacked my correspondent in Kabul. The two aides were frantically signaling him to shut up. This was a Western correspondent who should not know such things. Alexeyev ignored them. He was on a roll. But here's the other important thing. Dusko did not write a story about it. He could have done so and burned a contact, but he tucked it away and used it to inform his reporting about how the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was really going. Just as importantly, Alexeyev learned he could trust him. And I saw this happen time after time with Dusko. Dusko also used his Yugoslav background to connect to Yugoslav journalists and diplomats. They often had more information. And he never, ever stopped working. In his free time, for example, he would watch Soviet soccer matches on TV so that he could easily talk about the players the way that any Russian fan would. This workaholism took a toll on his health. It cost him his first marriage, but he was driven to succeed at the mission he set himself. History was helpful. The Soviet Union was in a time of transition, Brezhnev to Andropov to Chernenko to Gorbachev. The joke was that the Kremlin was selling season tickets to Red Square funerals. It was a time of internal turmoil, a time officials were arguably more susceptible to Dusko's approach. Ultimately, Dusko paid a steep price. His reporting was often more accurate than official US intelligence. When he reported Andropov's death hours before anyone else, for example, the CIA at first said he must be smoking pot. A 1992 Time magazine story all but accused him of being a KGB agent. It said his reporting was too good. Former Washington Post executive editor Ben Bradley was in no doubt US intelligence was behind the story. A who's who of fellow journalists cried foul against Time. Dusko won damages and an apology from Time in court. But as his wife and fellow journalist, I can say that he never quite recovered from the reputation assassination. I'm grateful on his behalf that his exceptional journalism is being recognized here today for what it was. He was and remains my journalistic hero. Thank you.
Should say that one of the people on Zoom tonight is Paul Golub, who was the editor of the Milosevic book. And when I told him that we were doing this, he said, boy, that was a hell of a good book. So whatever it is you guys did together under circumstances was impressive. Bob, tell us what you can tell us from inside the Post.
I love that story, Louise, of that interview. I want to say things about my relations with Dusko and then the Post. And Louise reminded me of the significance of the fact that Dusko really was Yugoslav. He was absolutely gifted at playing the games that East Europeans love to play, word games, political games, and sports too, very important. Dirty jokes, very important. Dusko had an astounding scatological vocabulary in Russian. Peter and I both had a driver in Moscow. We used to joke that he was definitely not a Rhodes Scholar.
Definitely not a scholar.
Ivan Fyodorovich. But Ivan once told me, "Откуда Doder знает все эти слова?" How does Doder know all these words? Where did he learn them? He never served in the army, That's where I learned. But he used this to wonderful advantage. He stunned Russian journalists and officials with his language abilities, which had a big impact. And as Louisa's story with the editor of Izvestia suggests, he disarmed them. He literally disarmed them. It was very impressive. Another personal anecdote. When I was sent to Moscow, 1971, Dusko gave me the best advice that I got anywhere. He said, you're going to run into a lot of official Soviet propagandists, and they're going to harangue you about the war in Vietnam and the sins of American racial segregation and this and that and the other. And don't go for it. He said, never get into a fight. You'll never win. And it doesn't make any advantage, give you any advantage if you were to win. So just go with it. He said, I'll just give you one line that you can use in all those situations that will get you out of the difficult moment and allow you to proceed. The line was, in Russian, "Каждого свой вкус." Each of us has his own taste. It was a classic Doderism, I thought, and really smart advice. I used it dozens of times over 3 years.
In Russian.
In Russian,
Yeah.
and it worked. It always disarmed the Russian. It was great. Let's go in the Post. It's hard to recreate. I had a little reading to remember the sequence. It's been mentioned. Not only was this Time magazine piece totally gratuitous and ridiculous, but it came out, what, 6 years after it would have been timely if it had been true, which of course it wasn't. But why, out of the blue, would Time magazine do this? And then some people that I knew, and in fact, got into ferocious arguments with Strobe and Sand Cloud among them. But be that as it may, I reread today Ben's wonderful memoir, which I recommend to anyone who hasn't read it. And he tells this story wonderfully of his dealings with William Webster, the head of the FBI. And when Dusko came back from Moscow, I was the national news editor, and Ben and I and Len Downey, the managing editor, cooked up the idea that we knew Dusko had a better sense of Cold War intelligence games than anybody on our staff. Why not assign him to the intelligence beat? Let him write about the CIA, the FBI, and so on. He didn't want to do it. Not sure why exactly. Maybe he knew it would lead to trouble. But in any case, that's what we assigned him to. And it turned out this was contemporaneous with one of the great phony Russian Soviet defections of that time. What was his name? Vitaly Yurchenko. He defected, and then ultimately he redefected. But he was the one who had the story of Doder getting $1,000 from the KGB, which Dusko rightly interpreted as terrible insult. $1,000.
You could do much better than that.
But that and Webster had a little bit of a set to, because Webster, urged on by his colleagues at the FBI, came to Ben and said, this guy really is not an appropriate person to cover us and the CIA because of his uncertain past. You really ought to find somebody else for that beat. Well, that's like telling Ben to, I won't say it, but he had no interest in being told by the director of FBI how to assign his reporters. He made that very clear to Webster. But he had wonderful Bradley checkpoint in his own mind. He said, we better look into this. I better look into this. And he went to Dusko and he said, I want you to go over and meet with my old friend, Edward Bennett Williams, the great Washington lawyer who was famous as a cross-examiner. And Ben's request to Ed was, please be sure my instincts are right. And the Doder is really okay. And I never heard Dusko's account of this meeting, but by Ed's account, he gave him everything short of the third degree, 2 hours, and finished the conversation, sent Dusko away, and called Ben and said, this is ridiculous. This guy's terrific. That was the word, terrific guy. And this, of course, emboldened Ben to call Webster again and say, forget about it. And by the way, if you have any doubts, call Ed Williams, he'll tell you about it. So it was wonderful that we were able to stand up for him long after the damage had been done. We certainly didn't save him, but we felt better. I think he felt a little better too. But this is a tough game. And the people at the time just behaved appallingly. You forget that your fellow journalists can do things like that. But there it was.
We'll never know exactly why Time did it.
Yeah, true.
We'll never know exactly why.
Well, this story was fed, the Yurchenko detail was fed to a very young, untested journalist. And he ran with
Hey,
it.
Petersell.
And
Remember that name?
he ran with it, and
Became an artist.
nobody who should have known better at Time stopped it. But Dusko took Time to court, and in Discovery, please read the book. It's fascinating. The Discovery
Politics and prose.
documents, the Discovery documents showed how Time magazine hardened that story, and it first started out pretty fairly, and by the end it was hardened. Dusko took them to court, and some of the stories they cited as him being scoops, one of them was on a callback from a New York Times story.
Mm.
It was so badly reported. Yeah.
The Weekly Astonisher. Time magazine used to be known.
What?
The Weekly Astonisher.
Currently in the hands of a billionaire from San Francisco. That's where Time is today. So
When's the last time you read? Not recent.
I can't answer that question because it's been a while. But one of the things about the Time, the case that fascinated me in the book, and really, it's painful, but it's absolutely mesmerizing, is that Time hired probably the top libel lawyer in the UK to handle the case. And, you know, the libel laws in the UK slightly better for the plaintiffs, but they're not really kind to anybody. And Dusko had to pay out for the cases that was going on. Mortgage his house?
Sold my apartment in London, sold his house in Alexandria, and
But-
there were no contingencies in Britain. Yeah.
Time made the claim that the suit, as I understand it, had no standing in the UK because Time did not sell magazines in the UK.
They did.
Well, they sold the international edition in the UK. I mean, that, you know, they were really spending as much as they could to defend this preposterous,
Well, to avoid defending it.
well, and challenging Dusko's lawsuit, which in the end, and the other thing is that they would have given him $75,000 more if he would allow them not to be apologizing in court. $75,000 was what some of the people at Time would spend on lunch.
And you can imagine what Dusko said to that.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Not repeatable here.
Big question.
Not repeatable here.
All right, so that gives you, I think, the context in which we're going to, and John and Bob, stay here because we're going to have a Q&A which I hope that you will join. And in the meantime, we're going to have this conversation with Josh, hopefully, who will be on a very large screen in the best tradition of Big Brother. Is that what it's going to be? The moment he's not. But he will be.
Just a second.
It's 2:00 in the morning where he is. No, 1:00 in the morning.
Great. I think we should be able to hear and see you now.
There he is.
Hi, Peter. Hi, everyone. Happy to be with you
Joshua.
tonight.
Are you Joshua or Josh?
Either's fine. Josh is okay.
All right, well, you're gonna be Josh tonight. We're glad to make the connection. This is always that point where, there's a little tension over technology. So I'm gonna start by reading what Celestine sent us this morning. And I know she may well be on the Zoom also, in which case, hello, Celestine. This is what she wrote. I'm so sorry not to be with you today. My chief regret is not to see Louise and to tell her in person how much I admire her steadfast support of Dusko and their enduring love for each other. I remember seeing them together in our Washington Post office in the early 1980s, at an early point in their then secret romance. And as I watched how they gazed at one another, it suddenly dawned on me that they were in love. It took me a while, but then I wasn't much of an investigative reporter. I remember many moments with Dusko, from the day he picked me up at Sheremetyevo Airport in 1984 and took me around to my temporary quarters in his Egyptian friend Marek's vacant apartment. From then on, Dusko found me places to live until he finally snagged an apartment in a new foreigners block. I can only imagine the bureaucracy, delays, and obstacles he had navigated with the UPEDK, the KGB agency in charge of foreigners, to get me settled. I didn't really speak Russian. I'd been taking classes in the months before I left, while working on the foreign desk, where I was witness to the drama surrounding his scoop about Andropov's death. My Russian came later, when I was in Moscow for the New York Times, and I'd married a Russian. I can only imagine how frustrating my fumbling attempts at the language must have been for Dusko when he was taking me around to meet his contacts and friends. I mostly remember Dusko late at night when he would sit in the bureau with either Marek or one of his Yugoslav friends, chomping on his cigar, wearing his battered windbreaker, waiting for the telex machine to cough up a good night from the foreign desk in Washington. Dusko was a master of the telex. He could write stories straight onto the telex, bypassing the tape the rest of us produced from our little bubble computers and then fed into the machine. I don't remember Dusko in the morning. I don't think anyone did. He would wander into the bureau sometime before lunch, which would either be at the U.S. Embassy cafeteria or somewhere with a Russian contact friend in one of Moscow's bleak restaurants. He'd confer about the day's chores with our driver, Tolia, or the wonderful Natasha, our Russian translator, who, despite coming from the KGB's agency UPEDK, became a friend. Occasionally, we celebrated together with our Japanese neighbors from the Asahi Shimbun. Any holiday, American, Soviet, Japanese would do. Natasha and the Japanese translator would set a table in their office with Russian zakuski. The Japanese correspondents provided whiskey while Dusko provided the vodka. We drank and toasted profusely, always a good way to share gossip and learn a language. Most of all, I remember Dusko's good cheer, his big smile, his generosity, encouragement, and common sense as he took me under his wing as a fledgling Moscow correspondent. His advice, his tips, his deep knowledge of the Soviet Union, and his command of Russian mat, or slang, minus the profanities, I suppose, were to help me enormously when I returned twice in the 1990s with the New York Times to a different Moscow and a completely different story. I wish he had been there to cover it too. Thank you, Celestine. That's more terrific. So what we're going to do first on this sort of panel section here is I'm going to start with specific questions to Serge and Anne and then Joshua on the Zoom, because they were there in different periods. And one of the things we want to try to understand is how Moscow coverage has evolved. Serge was there at the same time as Dusko.
That's right.
He was with the New York Times, which is to say not the Washington Post. So why don't you describe a bit, please, what the sort of setting was like at the time? What was it like to cover Moscow when the leaders were dropping like flies, dying every day, a year or so? And you could tell that Russia was in a stage of in a last stage of some kind, or at least it was hard to know exactly what was happening. So that's it. And
Yeah.
Serge, you're it's not over flattering to say your reporting was remarkable. And the fact that you have some Russian in your background probably
It
came in
helps.
handy. Better than being Yugoslav, I think.
I don't know, but it helped. But certainly thanks a lot, and I'm very honored to be part of this. It's great to see Louise, and you've done a really fantastic job in raising this critical issue at this stage. So I am really honored to be part of this panel. I don't know to whom I would describe here what Moscow was like in those days. I think most of you, I see so many familiar faces that I think we should just be sharing war stories rather than trying to lecture on that era. But it was a remarkable era. And I have to say that, you say Dusko or Dusko? I always knew him as Dusko.
Well, yes, I always called him Dushko, but when he came to
I'll call him
America,
Dusko.
because of his byline, he insisted being called Dusko in America.
see.
But Dushko is
Yeah.
his real name, yeah.
Okay, well, to me, he was Dusko. He was a friend. I mean, we covered the same story in very different ways, but he was a good friend. And reading his book, I was happy to see that he remembers the time he spent in our cottage in Canada, which is where he wrote one of his books. And he also remembers or recalls the incident. He called me to say, listen, I'm going to be reporting that Andropov died. I'd like to share it. I don't want to be out with this alone. So I raced around trying to match it, failed, called him, said, I can't do it. And he always respected that I wouldn't, just take it on his word. I just couldn't, of course. But that was the level of our communication and cooperation, in part, as I say, because we covered Russia very differently. Now, the very few of you here who don't know, that period, the end of the Brezhnev era, was really the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, and you could sense it. I mean, you knew everybody on the Politburo, almost everybody was near death, so you knew this couldn't last forever. Brezhnev could barely get through a speech, stumbling, and yet it was also the fiercest sort of the post-Stalin years. We were all followed. We were all attacked in the press. The Christian Science Monitor reporter was actually given some drug to make him appear drunk. Instead, he vomited and actually had the presence of mind to send whatever clothes he vomited on for analysis, and confirmed that he had been drugged. It was the kind of era where they were constantly trying to set you up, even when you tried to cover it sort of as objectively with our kind of a balanced approach. And one of the more amazing attacks I had was when I wrote a story about the Soviet film. I really liked Soviet films, and they had some damn good movies. And I wrote about what was happening in film, interviewed some people, and suddenly Literaturная Gazeta comes with this thing, slashing me for trying to ingratiate myself into people's trust by pretending I like their cinema. But it was also one of those articles where
Captain was trick.
you could read between the lines. They would say, and look what the slanderer says, and they quote 3 paragraphs, and look what else he dares say, and they quote some more. In the end, the whole article's in there, and Russians knew how to sort of read it. But, there was plenty to cover, and you had to make a choice. And I made a choice different from Dusko's. I come, as Peter noted, from a Russian background. I could speak it, I could stand in line and understand what they're saying. I could pass myself off as a Russian. And I was really interested in how people lived. So my reporting was to go out, travel the country. And this was not easy. You had to get permission. Wherever you went, you were followed all the time. But still, if you spoke the language and kept your eyes open, you could see many things. And Dusko, I guess perhaps coming from Washington, an acutely governmental town, as I now know, since I live there now, his fascination was with Soviet power and the obviously impending transition. And he made a point from day one of cultivating sources. Now, what cultivating sources means in a Soviet setting was also something very different. I mean, we're here in the journalism school where I imagine they teach you two sources, worship facts and all this stuff. All that went out the window in the Soviet Union. Not that we didn't practice the highest journalistic ethics, but you got two sources and both of them were probably lying. So it was really a place where you trusted your instincts, where you learned to trust the people that you would meet regularly and could tell when they were telling you something honest. And when somebody who comes out of the blue was probably trying to set you up, which I think happened to many of us as well. Nick Danilov, for example, who ended up being arrested for accepting something from a purported Catholic priest. You had to take risks, and you were always taking risks, and many people got caught and expelled and whatever else they could do. So there was a level of risk and even a bit of danger, but mainly you depended on your own instincts, and Dusko focused his on trying to gauge the power plays in the Kremlin. He had sources, and he also knew how to work that level of people who were licensed to talk to foreigners. He mentions them in his book. Alexander Movin, who was an analyst at Izvestia, the head of the American Institute, Arbatov. These were people who were part of them, but also authorized to speak a little bit to us. He had other sources, his Serbian sources. I mean, I knew that he had excellent people, and he was coming up with great stuff there on that front. And when he came up, for example, with Andropov's death, I, for one, had categorically no reason to doubt it. I knew that this was the world he was raking for information. And in fact, when he was sued, Time Magazine, I am proud to say I'm one of the people he asked for an affidavit, and I did one in which I tried to argue that the information that Dusko gathered could have been, that it was viable, that this could have been gathered by an excellent reporter without having to get $1,000. The charges were laughable from day one, but to me, they're more than laughable. They are really appalling to take somebody who is in a situation that is, to begin with, risky, dangerous, fraught, where you're really fighting against a system that not only lied and tried to get us from reporting facts, but their battle was to maintain this absolute monopoly on information. And since all of our stories were played back over VOA, we were a danger to them. And there was this constant effort also to undermine us, to discredit us, to say who we were. It is not at all surprising, like a guy like Yurchenko would go around Washington and say that a political reporter for the Post was a spook, but that somebody would believe this is the incredible part. And especially in that setting, to accept that accusation, I find just really, really insulting. I mean, I once was told, young intelligence officer in the embassy, we used to lunch at the embassy, asked me who my source was on a story. I said, hey, here's how it works. We don't share sources. He got up and said, whose side are you on anyway, Schmemann? I'll never forget that. But you sort of expect it of them, but you don't expect something like Time Magazine to start, mucking in the, or raking in the same muck. So I'm very glad that we are recalling this incident. As I say, my reporting went to the side of society, dissidence, culture, how people lived. Dusko went into politics, and we used to spend a lot of time. The image Louise described, I really liked this Lieutenant Columbo thing, well, I just got one more question. He did that so well, and it was a pleasure and privilege to know him. And I hope that this will help sort of not only clear his name, which needs no clearing, but put it in the right perspective.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think I'm right in saying there's only one of us in this room who was actually convicted of a crime. And so, Craig Whitney,
Greg.
do you, as I understand it, you were convicted of libel. But luckily for you, you were not in the country. So you wouldn't have gone to the gulag. But anyway, that's the level at which this stuff happened. So Anne, you came later and you were there in the period when, perestroika and glasnost and Gorbachev's visit to Washington in 87 or 88 and Reagan's visit to Moscow, where he and Gorbachev marched around Red Square, basically holding hands. What was that like? I mean, it clearly was a very different world than the one that Serge was in.
It was, but I got there at the very end of 1986, so I sort of caught the tail end of what everybody's been talking about. Yes, Gorbachev had been in power for maybe a year and a half, and everybody had this sense of this guy's different, but what does that mean? That was the thing that we were always trying to figure out, because there weren't that many concrete things that had happened yet that you could hang your hat on. And also when I arrived, it was just a few months after Nick Danilof's arrest, which became an international incident, and very much like the era that you all experienced. So the whole apparatus was still in place when I got there. We all lived in foreigners' compounds. There was a millie man in a little guard thing who would stop anybody trying to come in, even if they were coming in with me. They might, I remember a couple of teenage refuseniks who came in with me one time, and the millie man tried to stop them. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm trying to protect you," as though these, 14-year-olds or whatever they were going to somehow do me harm. We imagined or, assumed that everything was bugged in the apartment. The phones were bugged. We were followed. I don't remember particularly denunciations in the press. Maybe that Nick Daniloff certainly was, but I think that was maybe going away. But our cars still had the big yellow K004 license plate, so anybody knew, oh, that's an American correspondent driving around. We had to register trips with the foreign ministry, which might say, oh, you want to go to Baku next week? There aren't any hotel rooms available. You can't go. The staff that was hired, the translators that were hired, our housekeepers, we all had to go through Upended, and we knew that they were called in and debriefed about us. So, it was kind of like being in a fishbowl, which you tried to not think about too much. So, Gorbachev is there, that apparatus continued, a lot of it really, I was there for 5 years, and that wasn't particularly dismantled, but after a while it came to not matter so much.
Could you sense that the Soviet Union was
Yes.
on the skids of the,
Yes,
Okay.
probably not. I mean, I didn't have the experience that Serge did. So it took a while, but very soon after I got there, for me, a kind of demarcation line, like when did change really begin? For me, it was the release of Andrei Sakharov from exile. And a few weeks later, basically, all the political prisoners were let out of the camps around Perm and wherever else they were held. So that was a big deal. Newspapers were starting to publish things. I remember Andy Rosenthal one time bringing in, Moscow News and saying, look at this in paragraph 16. I don't even know what it said. It meant nothing to me, but there was some little nuance in there. This means something. Things are changing. So there were all these kind of little beginnings of change, not so little, but beginnings of change. I think people were cautious about it because basically the whole power structure and that whole apparatus that was watching us was in place. So was it still going to be like this next week or next month? You didn't really know for sure. Another really important moment for me, tiny little thing. There was a Jewish refusenik, Fyodor Finkel, who went on hunger strike to try to get permission to leave the country. And, we all had written about Fyodor and there were, some refuseniks, some people whose requests had been there for years were finally getting permission, but not everybody. It wasn't like they opened the doors and said, okay, if you want to leave, you can leave. So, you kind of don't know what to make of it. Anyway, Fyodor Finkel's having this hunger strike. And it goes on for weeks. And one day I'm at home because the office was at home. And I got 2 or 3 phone calls from people telling me, hey, Fyodor Finkel got his permission today. Okay, that's great. But then I thought about it and I asked one of them, but you told me to never call you from the home phone. So you'd have to go out, it'd be like 0 degrees and you're out looking for a payphone and that worked, which was difficult, just so you could call somebody and say, hey, I want to come over tomorrow or something. Why are you calling me at home? What does it mean? Does it mean like, we're not being recorded anymore? And they're like, no, I'm sure they're still listening, but it doesn't matter anymore. And so this for me was a great lesson that, the people who had lived through all these decades of repression were sensing things and seeing and hearing things that to me were kind of nuanced. And, they were still taking a risk. They didn't know that, things weren't going to turn around next week. But they just could feel this is different. It's okay to talk to you on the home phone. I mean, maybe there were some things they wouldn't want to talk about, but so that was, a big change. The apparatus was still there. As far as I know, when you came back into that apartment, maybe they were still recording. I don't know, but nothing, there were not consequences the way there used to be. And so from that moment, I started seeing and feeling and collecting string for a story that took me quite a while to do because it was hard to do for radio, but it was about the disappearance of fear. And for me, I mean, I was the only person there for NPR, so I had to write about everything, nuclear arms control, Kremlin politics, the latest economic reform plan. But to me, the most important story in those years was that disappearance of fear among, sort of ordinary people, not everybody, but, so many people suddenly could feel I can speak my mind and I'm not going to get sent off to the gulag. And that had all kinds of repercussions. In the Baltics, it meant, people started agitating for independence and setting up their own rival political movements. in a place like Magnitogorsk that I went to, you know, an environmental group had started that was pushing to get information about the horrible, you know, clouds of pollution that were killing people, giving them cancer and stuff. And so it was like the beginning of civil society, really. You know, could see people coming together and, you know, and agitating for things. You know, labor, the Siberian coal miners on strike. Oh my God, you know, what a huge story that was. And how the Kremlin had to finally start to respond to some of these things. So these were the repercussions of the disappearance of fear, and ultimately things like the independence movements in the Baltics, in Ukraine, you know, were very key in pushing, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Congress of People's Deputies, of course, which I think first met in '89, was, you know, Andrei Sakharov was one of the first speakers. This guy had been in exile for years. You know, people had never heard of him. His name was buried, and all of a sudden he's addressing the entire country because everything was carried live. And just, you know, it was like for 2 weeks, the whole country stopped and just watched and listened to the Congress of People's Deputies, which actually had no real political power. So, you know, it was deeply flawed in that sense as you know, as a political thing. But it was, again, this disappearance of fear. People got up and said the most incredible things and revealed, you know, some of the deepest, darkest secrets. And it just, you know, it went way, way, way beyond anything that, you know, Gorbachev had ever imagined with Glasnost. I wrote about, I just want to tell one little story. I wrote about this for the Harriman magazine a couple of years ago. And just, you know, it forced me to think back on all of the things that I saw and the stories that I covered, and these moments where, you know, that really struck you with, wow, you know, these people have been completely silenced for so long, and now, you know, everything is coming out. And so I talked about this story. I met an Afghan veteran in 1988 in Moscow. He was from Perm, which had been a closed city for, there'd been no Americans there since the 1930s when Stalin closed it. And, you know, this guy had, okay, the Afghan veterans would come back and, you know, they were completely ignored. You know, people didn't even know what was going on in Afghanistan. So, you know, there was no sort of sympathy for them or particular help. The state wasn't doing much to help them. And so this guy, Sasha Mokretsov, had started an informal veterans group, just like the environmental group in Magnitogorsk, or, you know, the independence movement in the Baltics. And he said, you should come to Perm. You know, I can introduce you to the veterans. We'll talk about Afghanistan. And I'm like, yeah, sure. But, you know, like, it's a closed city. And he said, oh, I'll get my friend Andre, who was the head of Komsomol, to send you an invitation. So Andre sends me this invitation. I go to the foreign ministry and they go, yeah, okay, you can go to Perm. And so I get to Perm. What I didn't know was that, you know, Andre was like acting on his own. He was a good friend of these veterans. He'd given them a place where they could come and meet, you know, and talk about their experiences and support each other and help each other out. But the local Communist Party bosses had no idea until probably I was on the plane that I was coming. And they're like, WTF, what have you guys done? You brought an American correspondent here. And so Andre is like under strict orders to keep me very busy. And I'm sure you guys remember these trips when, you know, we go to the local museum, and we took the longest boat trip ever on the River Kama at Perm. We went to the ballet one night. I took my equipment and was during intermission interviewing people about Afghanistan. Nobody thought that was weird, actually, because things had changed that much that, you know, I could ask them, well, what do you know about Afghanistan? What do you think about it? Blah, blah, blah. But, you know, my notion of doing this grand story about what do they know and think about Afghanistan and the provinces was kind of going down the tubes, except that the veterans, took me to, had a dinner with me, took me out. They were doing some war games, like some exercises and stuff in the forest. And I went out there with them. And one night, this wonderful veteran who had been blinded in Afghanistan and was going to the local university, arranged to, this was right after the ballet, so it was pretty late. He took me to the university, to the dorm where he lived, and there were like maybe a dozen students who came into this dorm room to talk about it. And he had said to them, this reporter wants to talk about Afghanistan. Will you come? And they came. And, it's like midnight by the time we're assembled there. And I went back and listened to this story when I was writing the Harriman piece. A couple of them were veterans, but most of them were just like 20 somethings. And they talked about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and pretty much all of them said, yeah, that was really illegal. We should never have done this. One of them said, in democratic countries, things like that don't happen. I did not stop to correct him on that. I thought, I'm just a reporter here. And then another one said of, the Soviets going into Afghanistan in 79, if people had known the facts then, I'm sure the answer would have been no. In other words, if we had real democracy, people would have spoken up and they would not have gone. And then here comes student number 3, who says, no, you're wrong. If the public had been consulted, we would have agreed. Why? Because in 1979, we thought in a completely different way. Perhaps we didn't think at all. And I just, I'm still so moved by that. But that was the
perfect.
Yeah. That was the kind of moment it was, and that's what I wanted to do for for NPR, to bring those voices, because
Well,
they were stifled for so long.
So what you said about the fact that fear subsided, the sense that you could perhaps live a life that resembled life in places that were not Russia. So that takes us to Joshua. Are you awake? Hi. So you're a Putin era correspondent. You probably, I'm guessing, and I don't want to condescend in any way, you probably were not extant 40 years ago. Am I right about that?
No, I have to admit, I just had entered, began my time on this earth exactly 40 years ago. So just made it.
Oh, close. So what that means is that uniquely, and I'm sorry that I'm giving you my back because I can't really do it any other way. What that means now is that the New Yorker Moscow correspondent is in Berlin. That you, as far as I know, you left. Well, why don't you tell us, A, what it was like covering Russia before the invasion, and why you felt and others felt that it was time to leave?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the chance to listen and learn about the work and legacy of Dusko. It's been a pleasure and an inspiration to hear his stories and all of yours about what it was like covering Moscow in a time before I got to see it, but at the time I'm certainly quite fascinated in hearing more of and could endlessly listen to stories about those days. In a way, it almost seems easier, though I'm sure it's a case of the grass always being greener, to have been a reporter in that era when the rules somehow seemed clearer, even if the rules were not easy, especially in the early 80s before the perestroika, the changes of perestroika opened things up in society as Anne described. But the nature of the Soviet system, which even if by its final years was a kind of hollow shell in which few people believed in the official ideology, nonetheless, it professed an official ideology basically right up until the very end. And that meant the state sort of had to act in a kind of at least surface or formal accordance with a professed set of, if not quite values, then at least rules, logic, and so on. It cared about its image to a certain degree, and that led to a higher degree of scrutiny and awareness of what foreign reporters were writing about Russia than anything I observed. By the time I arrived to Russia, it's a very different nature of authoritarianism, a modern or postmodern authoritarian system, I think, that not only differed from the Soviet antecedent, but learned, I think, from some of the mistakes of the Soviet system and what ultimately led to its collapse, specifically this gap between professed ideology and observed reality that made life so absurd for so many Soviet citizens, and I think even Soviet officials. The Putin state did away with ideology while keeping the repressive authoritarian attributes. And that's the state that I first saw as a student and then a journalist covering Russia.
When did you arrive?
In 2012. I had been to Russia many times before then, but my journalistic career in Russia began in 2012, and this was a time of protests. Some of you may recall the so-called Bolotnaya protests of that year, in which 100,000 people were in the streets protesting fraudulent elections, and it seemed like a moment when, in fact, Russia's politics might shift, however slightly, or improbably, in a direction toward more openness. And it's been interesting and poignant to listen to the other panelists tonight and the way you've arranged things, Peter, with a chronological arc. We heard about a system gradually, you could say on the one hand, in slow motion collapse, and on the other, opening up and providing more opportunities for people to express themselves and communicate freely and openly than they had before. The trajectory was toward openness, even if it was in a one step forward, two step back sort of way. And the Russia I observed starting in 2012 was the opposite, a story of increased consolidation, increased repression, the control or really the cleansing of the political sphere from anything that might even resemble not just opposition opinion or activity, but anything that existed outside the or exists outside the Kremlin's control. And all of that has gone into hyper overdrive with the invasion of Ukraine last year. But I'll talk about that when we get to that moment in my own experience in Russia. So I found Russia to be a wonderfully rich place to work as a journalist, as the panelists tonight all attested to in different ways. And that even as I found it difficult, if not impossible, to cultivate official sources, and this is something that my colleagues in the American and Western press corps also complained about, that officials became almost unreachable at many levels in the Putin system. And I think one of the reasons for that goes to what I said a few minutes ago, that the Putin system or the Putin state didn't really care all that much about its international image, especially, say, by the 2010s. I think that Russian officials were under no illusion about what kind of image Russia had on the world stage, and frankly feel like they didn't need to try all that hard. It was sort of pointless to try and cultivate Western opinion. And so we were, as in us Western or American journalists, were largely left alone, at least by the Russian authorities. On the one hand, you could say that was a good thing, weren't really actively harassed or pressured. But on the other, there wasn't a lot of attention or interest in us into what could be gained by speaking to the Western press corps. But what we could do, especially in the beginning, is move around the country. And in that we had great freedom, especially compared to those who worked in the more stifling gray days of the Soviet Union in the 70s and early 80s. We could go anywhere you wanted. You could take your Russian journalist visa and take a flight to Grozny and spend 2 weeks in Chechnya. I wrote a long story about the rule of Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya for the New Yorker in, I guess, around 2016. And I spent over a month in Chechnya on a number of trips just by getting on a plane and going there. You didn't need additional approval. You didn't need to check in with a minder. At least formally and officially, the country was open. I went to Yakutia, to the Arctic Circle, or well above the Arctic Circle. I guess this would have been 2021 for a story that was published just before the war, to write about scientists studying the melting or thawing permafrost there. And that was also something you could do without making a fuss about it or asking anyone for permission. So in that sense, it was a real adventure and a real luxury to work in Russia, such a big place, physically big, geographically big, but also big in terms of the richness and diversity of the stories there, and the extent to which you could take advantage of them. And now in hindsight, here I am talking from Berlin about what an opportunity that was, because out in the country at large, people, not necessarily officials, but people were happy to talk to you. There was an eagerness, an interest, a mutual curiosity I often found when showing up in places across Russia where I was interested in life in this town, but people were also interested in me. And that led to a kind of easy, immediate, not quite camaraderie, but at least interest in each other that fed into an openness and a desire to exchange. And I never felt, or rarely felt, that I was hitting a repertorial dead end when I was writing about the Russian people and Russian culture and the everyday life or experience of being Russian in Putin's Russia. While at the flip side, which I've alluded to in different ways, finding it very difficult, if not impossible, to write about official Russia. That really was a Byzantine system that was almost impenetrable for me and for other correspondents in Moscow, and only became more so over time. The trajectory of the Putin state and the decade I lived there was one toward more internal control, paranoia, claustrophobia, all of that matched with increasing aggression and hostility directed outward on the world stage. Certainly the annexation of Crimea and the first war in the Donbass in 2014 were key points in that story. I was in Crimea in the days before annexation. I spent a lot of time in Donbass that summer in 2014. And in a lot of ways, that was the warning sign for what would come 8 years later. But it was clear that Russia was turning away from the rest of the world, at least from the West, in an opposite trajectory from what we've heard about tonight, from the 80s turning into the early 90s, when it felt like Russia was both opening up and in so doing becoming more interested in embedding itself with global and Western institutions. By the time I showed up to Russia, the country was extricating itself from those relationships, at times with great haste and aggression, at least rhetorical aggression. But interestingly, none of that or little of that affected the day-to-day job of being a correspondent on the ground in Moscow. We weren't followed, at least not that we knew about. We weren't actively harassed. We didn't really have our visas denied. We weren't kicked out of the country. We were really left alone, as I've said in a few different ways already. And that was kind of the oddity and magic, in a way, of reporting in Putin's Russia. Even up until, all the way up until, let's say, 2021, another key moment in Russia's recent political history, when the protest leader or opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who had been poisoned, nearly killed was taken to Germany for emergency medical care, then quite amazingly and heroically came back to Russia, where he was immediately arrested, prompting a wave of protest and a renewed political crackdown. This was just some months before the invasion of Ukraine, but at the time it felt like the most repressive turn the Putin state had yet taken. And even in this repressive turn, when our friends and colleagues who were Russian journalists were being labeled foreign agents, the resurrection of a Stalin-era locution that is meant to complicate and discredit the work of journalists and activists and others in Russia. Foreign journalists continued to be outside of this paradigm. The Russian state, at least as far as we could tell, didn't take much of an interest in our work. And this felt increasingly improbable. We would make sort of dark jokes with each other about, how long can this go on when one Russian outlet after another is being either forced to close or given one label or another, foreign agent, undesirable, and so on. But nonetheless, the work of foreign journalists in Russia went on, and actually that gave us a renewed or more emboldened sense of mission, that given just the luck or happenstance of our passports, citizenship, visas, we could do the kind of work that was becoming increasingly difficult just from a legal or safety perspective for
Take us
Russian journalists to
take
do.
us to the moment when you, as a New Yorker writer, you don't have the sort of vast foreign sort of correspondence infrastructure that, say, the New York Times had. Why did you, a very respected correspondent whose editor in New York is David Remnick, who is, one of the great Moscow correspondents, why did you choose to leave?
I'm not so sure I would even label it a choice. I'll tell the story quickly. I left Moscow on what I thought was a reporting trip of indeterminate length, but certainly a reporting trip, not a final departure from Moscow by any means, on, I think it would have been February 8th or thereabouts of 2022. And I flew from Moscow, not directly, of course, but made my way to Kiev, where there was already lots of talk in Kiev, in the West, everywhere, about the possibility of invasion. Would Russia invade? A lot of speculation on that score. Interestingly, I found that those of us who had lots of experience in Russia, and Putin's Russia specifically, tended, in hindsight, maybe to get the invasion story, if not wrong, not quite right. It was people who weren't interested in Russia, but interested in military affairs and the way that war works outside of its political context, I think, who saw the war coming more clearly than us Russia correspondents who, again, were by no means naive or Pollyannish about the threat. We're all quite clear-eyed about it. But because the invasion made so little political sense for Putin, it was a harder thing to grasp, I think, for some of us than those who looked at the military position on the ground and understood quite clearly that war was looming. In any case, I arrived in Ukraine in mid-February to write a piece about the talk of war, the expectation of war, would there be a war? And that reporting ended up going all the way through February 24th, the day of the invasion, when I was in Ukraine, in Kramatorsk, a city in Donbass, which itself was bombed early that morning. So I woke up with the rest of Ukraine at 5 o'clock that morning to the sound of missile strikes out the window, and ended up staying in Ukraine at that point several more weeks through the middle of March. And by that point, I decided not to return to Russia. As many in the audience may be aware, in early March, Russia, the Duma, and then signed by Putin, passed a number of what would be fair to call wartime censorship laws, criminalizing, on the one hand, I believe the terminology is the discrediting of the Russian armed forces and activities abroad, distributing of quote unquote fakes about the activities of the Russian military. And there was a real urgent exodus, I think is fair to call it, of Western journalists, foreign journalists, essentially all working Russian journalists from the country in a matter of days, because it was just so unclear about how far and widely these laws would be implemented, which on paper effectively criminalize much or all honest reporting about the war. And in that context, I decided not to return.
Am I right that you have a Russian wife?
Yeah, so that was also part of the
Did she with you in Berlin?
right. And so
Would it have been unsafe for her?
well, I'm not sure, and nor do I sort of like to indulge in my own stories of bravado or safety or lack of safety, given the privilege in which I ultimately operate and am able to operate as a journalist with an American passport, with the backing of an institution like the New Yorker. But then my Russian visa expired, which meant I no longer had just the bureaucratic or administrative ability to re-enter the country. And I would like to and plan to and hope to get another Russian visa. Journalists have begun to return to Moscow over the summer. A number of them are doing really great and important work from inside Moscow. Valerie Hopkins of the Times, Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal, Andrew Roth from the Guardian. All of them are friends and colleagues I hold in high esteem. So those who have the ability to enter Russia are doing so, and under very fraught conditions, producing great work. But for those of us outside of Russia, we've fallen back on thankfully what has been the real plethora of technological and communication tools that allow us to stay in touch with those in Russia, as well as those Russians. We're not the only ones, right, who've left Russia. There's been a mass exodus of Russians from the country, ending up in places all over Europe and elsewhere. And whether it's Telegram, Signal, following other social media channels, there is an extraordinary amount you can do to stay in touch with people from anywhere. But of course, there's no substitute for that visceral experience of living and breathing the streets of Moscow and the mood there.
What I'd like to do is to move to the next sort of round of questions and leave time at say 7:45 or so for the questions from folks here, and then the lavish zakuskis that have been prepared by the Columbia Journalism School in the back, so we can have a little time for a reception afterwards. So I just want to make one comment about the Putin era, which is that in 2000, when he was first named, I was approached. I was the publisher of Public Affairs and had been working with Yeltsin, and I was approached by a man named Valentin Yumashev, who was an advisor first to Yeltsin and on his way to being an advisor to Putin. And he said, how can Putin introduce himself to the world? Should he write a book? And I said, no, because everybody will know he didn't write it. So what I suggested instead was that 3 Russian journalists have unfettered access to him, interviewing him, and that we would publish the results of that as a book. And the reason I mentioned it is the Putin that presented himself at the time told us things like his nickname was Vovka. He gave us photographs of himself with his puppy. He told us how devoted he was to his beautiful wife, who had been a stewardess. In other words, and we published it as a book called First Person, as sort of, this was his effort to portray himself as just a terrific guy. 2000.
How were the reviews?
I will say, I wondered whether Kaiser would speak up. The only, and he did satisfyingly. The only person who really called the book was Bob, who said, no, this is a man who's pretending. But I'm telling you, Vovka, the puppy, the wife, this was what he wanted the West to see. Because that was 20 hours or more of journalists interviewing him.
No more.
More, 24. Anyway, the point is, between 2000 and what he did on February 24th, 2022, shows you the progression of what it was that Putin wanted or thought and what he became.
And
So-
can I say one thing about that book? Because I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists then, and
Buy it?
of course, yeah. And in there, the journalists asked him about Andrei Babitsky, who I
Right.
think may have still been, we didn't know exactly where he was. He worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, covered Chechnya rather too well for the Russian authorities, and disappeared. And, they're asking about Babitsky and what are you going to do about this? And, this is terrible. And basically Putin says he's committed treason. You can commit treason with your pen just as well as with a weapon. To me, that's the most telling moment in the book, but then there's the puppy and everything.
Then
else.
there's the puppy. So I want to, in the time before we sort of go to questions, I've got a couple of things that I wanted to ask the panel, Joshua. Oh, wait a minute, I said you could go. No, I didn't say you could go. I said you could go when we get to questions. So I want you to hang on for just a little bit longer. And this, I'm going to read this question because it's not a question that we would have asked ourselves in the past necessarily. I said, through the Soviet era, Americans tended to describe the USSR as Russia and the people as Russians, even those who were Ukrainian, Kazakh, Muslim, Jewish. But with the breakup of the empire, the complexity of the population has become much clearer. And I've often wondered whether we were doing a disservice at the time as we were writing about Russia and Russians by not really understanding the character of the country. Serge, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, you had mentioned that earlier and I've thought about it. I know that perhaps with a Russian background, I tried to avoid referring to them as Russians and want permission.
But even Ukrainians call themselves Russian.
Yeah, but I want permission from Abe to refer to Soviets. Before that, this is Abe Rosenthal. We couldn't refer to them as Soviets, but I don't think we were necessarily doing a disservice because the story was the effect, the impact on a vast array of different people of a system, of a Soviet system in which people from every one of those nations participated. I mean, the bosses, the Politburo came from everywhere. The bosses in Ukraine were probably even worse than the bosses in Russia. It was a system, it was an ideology, and it was a coercive system run by a clique of people who didn't really identify themselves as Russian, who followed an ideology. And I think that's what we were covering. And I think those of us who traveled widely across the Soviet Union did identify how different nations were differently repressed. Maybe not enough, maybe we didn't anticipate the kind of nationalism and identity that sprang up after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think at that time, I would not call it a disservice. I would say it was the reality. If you talked to people in Uzbekistan, their enemy was very much the Soviet system and not necessarily the Russian people.
But if you
To
asked
call
them,
all
if you
Russians
asked
would have
them,
been a mistake.
would they have said, I'm an Uzbek or a Russian?
They would say, and they always did, that we have 392 nationalities working at this factory, and they were very proud of this. So they themselves, the Soviet authorities, did make a point of the number of nationalities they had in their system. And I don't think people out there referred to themselves as Russians, no.
So, Anne, you were a radio correspondent, so you were doing things in a very different way. When you look back on your reporting in that period when so much was changing and the fear was subsiding and so on, do you have the feeling that we were able to truly interpret how this thing was going to fall apart? If anybody had told you when we were there in the 70s, mid-70s, that 15 years later, I left in 77, there would be no Soviet Union. Not only would people say we were smoking pot, but we'd be hospitalized.
Yeah, but don't forget, Andrei Amalrik wrote a book, Will the Soviet Union Survive? Until 1984.
Yeah, well, let's not go into Amalrik, but there's a whole other thing there, which is that he was right, but he didn't really know what was going to happen. He was just saying that there was he did not survive 84, but the point is that internally, what he was identifying was a form of decay and corruption. That's true. But no one in 1977 or 76 or 5 would have told you that there will be no Soviet Union in 1991. And I've often wondered how we were in that sense. Not surprised, but how we overestimated the Soviets. And I wanted to, and tell me, did it occur to you in 1988, 9, when Gorby was, on top of the world? I can tell you that the competition to get a book by Gorbachev was intense. I didn't get it. But was it conceivable even then that the whole thing would come crashing down?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can't pinpoint the month or the year exactly, but, August 1991, when they put Gorbachev under house arrest and try to roll everything back, and you just looked at these guys, the Puchisti, and thought, boy, you are so out of touch. That was, it would have been hard to articulate prior to that, yes, I believe it's all going to collapse by the end of this year. But at that moment, it became very, very clear. There was another one of those incredible moments. The first night of the coup, the coup leaders had a press conference, and it was broadcast live to the entire country. And the best question was asked by a 20-something Russian journalist. I always thought it was so important that it was a Russian who asked this. And she just stood up and said, "Tell me, please, do you recognize that what you carried out last night was a state coup?" The entire country is seeing this, and that's just, I mean, this is where the country and the media and everything had come to. So yes, I think it was, very clear that things were not going to go on as they already were not going on as they had been. The thing that we could not foresee was what happened after the collapse.
So Joshua, you're looking ahead, and I want to sort of take us into the inevitable what next question. Because people tend not to remember as much that in 1964, Khrushchev was ousted. 56, there was denunciation. In 64, he was ousted. There was an attempted coup. Remember what it was that it was it Churchill who said, they like people fighting under a rug, and then one of them gets. Pshh. So the question I have, Josh, are the people who you are in touch with, and you're in touch with them presumably by phone and text and so forth, what is their sense of where Russia is going to be going in the next year, 2 years, 5 years?
Of course, no one can say or know with certainty, and I think some of the most what we would think of in terms of structurally their position in society, politics, economy, would be the people who would have a sense, and they don't have any sense at all. And I'm think that people in the Kremlin close to Putin don't have a sense, because the situation is so dynamic and so live and unpredictable. Clearly, the war did not go according to plan, as Putin and those around him imagined. And now the plan seems to be to make one up as they go, or to return to a kind of situational, tactical approach to events that Putin, I think, has long been comfortable in and feels most natural in. But in the context of a shooting war with your neighbor, which is backed by some of the largest or the largest militaries in the world in terms of aid and other support, that's an increasingly fraught and high stakes and in some ways dangerous thing to do and way to approach the situation. That doesn't mean that Russia will automatically lose the war. That certainly doesn't mean that Putin will be thrown from power, but Putin himself, by invading Ukraine, has put in motion the greatest threat, or certainly the greatest source of instability to his own rule and continued hold on power that he's seen in 22 years. No one has put Putin's rule under more threat or under more of a question mark than Putin himself. And that's among the many great tragedies and ironies of the invasion. Now, I'm thinking or found myself nodding along to Anne's retelling and others about the decay and ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union as being something that both had precursors and signals that one could track, but ultimately the final collapse of the Soviet Union was something that was hard to pinpoint and predict with certainty, and many people didn't see coming. And I think that one could say the same thing about the Putin state. It looks actually quite stable if you look at the real levers of power in Moscow and who controls them, and is there an outside force that could potentially disrupt them or penetrate them or seize them for him or herself, and that it seems rather difficult to imagine. But that said, a system that seems outwardly stable, almost eternal, can disappear quite quickly in a flash. That's the lesson of history. That's the lesson of Russian history. So we should always be alive to that possibility. But to answer to the best of my repertorial abilities your question about what people in Moscow are feeling, is that this is going to go on for a while. Having not achieved the quick lightning victory that he hoped or was promised by his generals, Putin quickly settled in for the long war in Ukraine, with Ukraine, the long war with the West, with not just a military component, but an economic one. Putin is preparing Russian society. It was very telling, for example, that Putin's New Year address, rather than trying to say something uplifting or project an air of normalcy for the Russian people, he gave his address for the first time standing in front of a crowd of uniformed military personnel. Many Kremlin watchers interpreted that as a sign, a purposeful sign of messaging in terms of transmitting to the Russian public the kind of year they can expect. And I think that the war will be with us for a while, and Putin's great strategic bet, to the extent he is engaged in strategy and not just tactically trying to seek out advantage on a day-to-day basis, is that he and the Russian state and the Russian people, who he's essentially hijacked into this whole endeavor, have more stamina and staying power for fighting this war, again, the military war, the economic war, than does the West. And that's his big wager. Hard for me to say whether he's right or wrong about that, but I think that that's the big test to come, and one I don't think we're going to see the end of this year, and maybe not next. I think this could go on for a long while.
Thanks, Joshua. In the interest of time, I'm not going to ask everybody exactly the same question because the answer is, we don't know. Would you all agree? We just don't know how this is unless you do, you know?
I'm not authorized.
The reality is that as Napoleon learned and as the Germans learned, the Russians are stubborn people, so we don't know. And when we meet again in a few years to reflect on it, maybe we'll have an answer. But I wanted to leave this 15 minutes before we go to the Zakuski over there for questions, because this is a crowd that really will have a lot of questions. John Darnton would like to ask a question. Do you want to, there's a mic,
We have
John.
a mic up there if you want to ask.
What?
I'd like to ask two, if you'll indulge me. They're very quick.
Does everybody know who John Darnton is? Pulitzer Prize winning correspondent of the New York Times,
First of all-
Poland, so forth.
It's wonderful that you're doing this panel. I applaud it. It's great. There's been a lot of talk about the KGB, but not much about the CIA. This is a question mostly, I guess, for Bob and Louise. In the Inconvenient Journalist, you talk of Dusko writing a story in which he talked about the sloppy methods of the CIA, that they missed the Andropov coup that he got, Andropov's death. Do you think that was the motive, a kind of resentment of him? And do you think it was basically Robert Gates himself who dropped the bug in William Webster's ear and fed this pernicious lie to the young, naive Time journalist?
Louise?
I think that besides that night of Andropov's death, there was a lot. Dusko always said to me, you know, his reporting was constantly on the front page of the Washington Post. And people in Washington, officials in Washington were reading it, and they were seeing it was very different from the reporting they were getting from CIA and all the intelligence sources. Dusko, there's one story that he tells, and it's in the book, that when Reagan wanted to stop the building of the Siberian pipeline, and he put sanctions on equipment going to Russia, to the Soviet Union to build it, he, not having much information, he wrote a piece, I think it was for Outlook, an analysis piece in which he said that in his analysis, the Russians, knowing their psychology, not only would they finish the pipeline, but they would do it ahead of time. And the next day, he met the CIA station chief in the parking lot in Gatuzovsky. And the CIA station chief said to him, "I have never seen a more despicable piece under your byline." Guess what the Soviets did? Finished the pipeline ahead of time. So I think that there was a lot of resentment, and Dusko was a very abrasive person. I mean, he, on the morning after he got his Andropov scoop, and he just assumed that night that the embassy and operatives in Moscow would have the same information as he had, because he went out at night and saw the KGB headquarters lights blazing, and he put together signs that Andropov had died.
So you think they had it in for him?
Yeah, so the KGB station chief said to him, "Why didn't you tell us?" He said, "Well, it's not my job to tell you."
CIA.
You know, the CIA, exactly. So there's time after time after time. You know, the embassy was so miffed at his reporting on Andropov that they commissioned a report to prove that Dusko had been tipped off to cover themselves. So yeah, it was just a question of he had better analysis, better reporting.
Sir, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to note, Phil Taubman, our colleague, has just done a book about George Shultz and covers the period when Gorbachev came to power. And he, in the book, notes that the CIA continued to argue long past anyone else that Gorbachev had brought change. They kept saying, no, there's no change. This is just younger, more.
And it was the senior analyst at the CIA,
Gates.
Robert Gates.
Gates.
Wrong.
So, the track record is not great.
Yeah.
Bob, you want to deal with
Yeah.
the-
I want to tell one quick anecdote. Murray Marder, the great diplomatic correspondent of the Post, took me to lunch with Richard Helms on the eve of my departure for Moscow. Must have been June 1971, July. And Helms said, I just want to caution you about the life you'll have in Moscow. He said, you have to understand, nothing that you see in the Soviet Union during your tour of duty will be real. Every event that you have are lucky enough to be part of will have been staged for your benefit. Well, I can honestly say, never as a government official, even William C. Westmoreland, said something as preposterous to me as that. It was just ridiculous, but it was the CIA mindset, same mindset, which said there can't be change. It's impossible to change.
John, you said you had a second question?
Well, I don't want to monopolize, but it's
Be
just,
quick.
all right. How much responsibility does the West, in particular, the US bear for Russia's retreat back to its imperialistic, autocratic nature? We hear stories
Want us
that
to answer that in 30
Jim
seconds?
Baker assured Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't move east,
did.
et cetera,
He
et
did.
cetera.
He did. He did. The answer to the question is way outside, I think, the realm of the time, but the answer is, John, that's the debate that's going to go on pretty much forever. Whose fault was it? Who lost? Who lost Russia? We'll never know for sure. It was a consequence of many things. I'm preempting my position as moderator, and I apologize. This young lady, can I call you a young lady? This journalist is Russian by origin. So tell us what you want to know.
Hi, I'm Sonia. Thanks so much for speaking with me and for Azimuth.
Speak into the mic.
For organizing this. I'm writing my master's thesis on how the Ukrainian war has affected the Russian and Ukrainian diaspora in New York City. So I wanted to kind of ask you guys a question about this. As hundreds of thousands of Russians flee Russia because of the war, and also there's large Russian-speaking communities in New York City, I just want to ask your guys' opinion on the media coverage of this.
Of
And you
what?
mentioned humanity in the beginning. Do you think the media is reporting on these Russians fleeing in a more monolithic type of way, not being able to extrapolate them apart from the Kremlin? Or do you think they're doing a good job? And I don't know, just what you guys think about that.
Serge, you want to take that on?
Actually, you're doing the thesis. You should tell us. I have no idea. I mean, broad questions. How is the media covering? I don't know. I don't think we've had a lot of coverage, to be honest, but if you can tell us, I'd be very curious to know. Do you think there's been not enough coverage or too much or?
I think the coverage has been a little one-sided. I think a lot of people forget that every 30 minutes, a Russian is arrested for protesting the war, despite, losing their jobs, being kicked out of university. Even now, you can lose your property in Russia for discrediting the army. So there's this one hand of it where I think a lot of Western media doesn't touch upon this enough, that, it's also really hard for them. Of course, I understand it's much worse for the Ukrainians, but I don't know, it's that, there's a difference between Russians and the Kremlin, and we're not responsible for Putin all the time.
So truth of the matter is that we're at a loss because we're not really as present on the ground as we would be otherwise, but thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sir.
Hi, I'm Peter Clement. I actually worked at the CIA for the period that you all have been discussing.
You say
Like,
you were working at
I
the
worked
CIA
there
in that period?
since
Thanks for coming.
1979. No, I want to thank you because as a political analyst working in the Directorate of Intelligence, not operations, I am indebted to all of you. And I can assure you that all of the analysts who I worked with and later worked under me were avid open source readers. And we very much, I personally view all of you as sources. I would cite an immense amount of open source material in my analysis. So I genuinely am indebted. So thank you for the panel tonight. I just had two quick comments. The collapse of the Soviet Union is a far more detailed debate, as I'm sure you all know. And I'm of the view that we did not miss it at all, and it's been documented and much has been written on it. So point one. Secondly, two questions. The book First Person, which I use in my class that I teach here, as a recommend, it's required reading. There is a huge amount of material on that. It's far more than just the nickname and the dog. To me, there's a huge amount of psychological insight into Putin. The whole section on NATO, his conversation with Kissinger, his genuine belief the Soviet Union was collapsing, or that Russia was collapsing, that whole discussion about the period during the Second Chechen War. There's a lot in there that reveals his psyche and his fears that I think are very useful to think about. So my question is this: a former colleague of mine who was a national intelligence officer named George Colt. George traveled a huge amount to the former Soviet Union. And I always marveled at the fact that the Soviets expelled him. His Russian was superb. He had a number of sources in a number of places. He talked to everybody. And they denied him a visa. So for the rest of his career, George went to all the other 14 former Soviet Socialist republics and got a very one-sided view of Russia. So I'm thinking about today, is it wise for Moscow to be basically discouraging any serious journalist from coming in to report? And the off chance that maybe they could get a wide range of views among Russians, of course, if people can even feel comfortable to talk. And I take the point about there's no longer an absence of fear, it's complete fear. But trying to at least talk to some people to get some insights about what regular Russians are thinking about the war.
That's a very important question. Let's see if we can get the answers, which is that can you really know what's going on in Russia when you're not actually there? That's, I guess, the question is, and if Josh were here, that would be the question I would pose to him. Does anybody want to take that on? Can you really know what's going on?
Wasn't that a good question at every stage
What?
of the Cold War?
That we didn't know it was.
We didn't really know a lot. I
I think
so.
it's certainly become a lot easier with the internet. You can read so much more that's coming out. You can call people in Russia. And I think your idea of covering it from the republics, there's a little think tank here. My son happens to work there, so I know what they do, but they provide a platform for Russian scholars who are working outside of Russia to share opinions. So there's really a lot available now, and I think it is possible. But of course, I think Josh would know far better.
He's gone to bed.
Oh,
And one question I wanted to see if when you were CPJ and subsequently, how compared to the other places in the world, how dangerous really was Russia, and how dangerous is it really now, do you think? Well, you don't really know. But I always wondered whether those of us who were there in the bad days or bad old days, and we were being attacked and followed and harassed and everything else. I don't think any of us, I think because we were American correspondents, we didn't think in the end we would follow Nick Danilov, Aptos. So how dangerous do you really think it is?
Well, if you're asking also sort of historically, how dangerous was it? I mean, there's this, sort of conventional wisdom, not just about the Soviet Union, but, most foreign countries that, the foreign correspondents there in a very repressive dictatorship are never at the kind of risk that the local journalists are. Even Nick Danilov, I can't remember how many weeks he was held in Lefortovo, but you always kind of knew this isn't going to, they're not going to lock him up and throw away the key. Today, what is the danger? I mean, I was very interested to hear Josh talk about this. Why did everybody leave? Because it's so striking that, people who've had bureaus there for many decades, all of a sudden they're empty.
Overnight.
Yeah.
But
And-
Charles Maines of NPR is there.
Yeah, but he's not saying a whole lot on the air, is he? The one person who I hear who is blanking out on his last name, the guy who's there for BBC.
Yes, Steve Rosenfeld.
Yeah.
Is that his
How
name?
does he manage it? I don't know. I'd love to know, but I also kind of don't want to ask him. I don't want to put him on the spot.
He is the only one who stayed throughout.
And he left for a few days. I
Well,
think,
but
like not
he
even
has
a
been
week.
there doing nightly reporting.
And he says the word war, and I look at his reports and I think, well, is he doing anything different? I don't.
Maybe he's
think so.
working for the KGB.
Well, Yeah,
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I just have a quick question, kind of about what Josh was talking about. It's too bad he went to sleep, but I really appreciate you guys being here, by the way. Really just was curious, he mentioned kind of his perspective on how the war, thought was probably gonna be more protracted, given Putin's mindset, to kind of dig in and take this tactical approach. But I was thinking, like, I've read so much about a lot of the economic kind of realities, and I'm just wondering if you guys, from a historical perspective and having been there and maybe spoke with a lot of the officials that, think about war and the politics of it, how do you see like the economic realities kind of confronting that political mindset to maybe just dig in and, play a long game when
Good
interest
question.
rates
So-
are pretty high, things like that?
Why don't we get a quick round and
There was a terrific piece in the journal this week, I guess, about the fact that the oil pressures are really working, that the Russians are in a terrible pickle, and they've lost a great deal of their customer base, and they have no chance or prospect for reviving it. No future German politician is going to say, let's revive that Nord Stream pipeline and do business again with the Russians. That's kaput for a generation. So I think it's a smart question that it can be very serious. And if it drops off the cliff, it drops very dramatically and suddenly the Russian economy.
Yeah, I think the Russians are very capable of tightening their belt for a long time. And I don't think they're feeling all this quite yet, but they will. There's going to be a long-term decline, economic decline, stagnation. But I don't think that that's going to be the key moment. More is whether they can continue or whether the people around Putin continue believing that he's doing the right thing, that this isn't damaging. And I think the part of their life that's going to hurt Russians the most is just losing what they could do before, traveling abroad, buying a car, the kind of little freedoms they gained in the last 20 years. That's the part that's going to hurt. I would also maybe disagree with a bit with Josh. These dictatorships look like they're infallible until the day they fall. And I'm not sure from what we're seeing that Putin is entirely firm. This appointing the chief of staff, Gerasimov, to be the head of the whole operation, that to me smacks of some kind of fight that I don't get, but there is something going on up there. But I mean, to your question, they will tighten their belts for a long time. That's not going to be the element that breaks them.
so we're going to close, and I want to once again thank Louise. Thank
thank you,
Dusko.
guys.
And John's been sitting here quietly, but we wouldn't be here if it hadn't been John. John's the one who said to us months ago, can you guys do something? It's about damn time you did something, and we did, and I think we should thank John, and thank you all. Columbia has provided a repast such as this.
Chuck, Benoit, just a place there. I've asked you.
That was good. I think that,
If I may, I just wanted to make a quick note that on February 7th at 6:30, one of the DuPont finalists, the film Navalny, will be showcased here at Columbia University in the lecture hall. So just keep that on your radar, since I know so many of you are watching this region. Thank you all for coming. Please help yourselves to snacks. Oh, did you want to add anything?
yeah,
Please.
but
Hi, I'm the director of the DuPont Awards, and just a little more information. It also includes a talk back with the director of the film, Daniel Rohr. And it's February 7th, 6:30 to whenever it's time.
telestage amongst.
Oh,
I
wonderful.
knew
thank
George
you.
very well.
Okay,
She's still alive?
to Rita, to Rita. But without you, with enormous, with gratitude.
Really? Believe it.
I even gave you a name.
No, but you found Michael. Oh,
Send me,
it's amazing. And he
send me
said,
the book.
he never works on books the way that he works on that one. He had been reading John le Carre and he was an education for me, I can tell you that.
I'll put the address in.
Well, thank you.
Bill Odom,
Yeah,
Love
well,
George.
I'm so glad that you saw.
he told me early on,
Classical.
this is our best guy.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, no, Michael made it. Yeah. Yes, 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 yes. So I'm actually training as a coach. Have you ever heard of Yes, yes, so I'm really.
You know,
trained up, and then he inspired me to do that. Thank you. Yeah. So have you heard of anyway, I'm trainer's book coach. I'm almost certified, and it's Michael and this